Hello, Between the Chapters Book Club. Admin LJ here once again with another really exciting live Q&A panel. I've been looking forward to this one for a couple of weeks now. I really love all three of these authors. I've worked with them for a while. They're all incredible, so it's going to be a lot of fun. More so than that, again, you guys know me. I am such a history person. I'm such a history nerd, history buff. You know, it was one of my favorite subjects in school, obviously on top of reading and writing and all of that. But history was always one of my top favorites. So I really love getting to talk about history and the research and all of the influences that go into historical fiction novels. And even more so, I love to hear about women's history and how women were seen throughout the ages, the marks that they left on the world. And it's just one of those conversations that hits a lot of my niche areas of interest and excitement. So I'm really looking forward to this one. If you didn't already get the theme, tonight we are doing our final Women's History Month event. We have three fabulous special guests. We have Denny S. Bryce, Amanda Skenandore, and Donna Everhart. All three of these ladies are authors of historical fiction, and all of their novels feature really strong and empowering women and women throughout history. All three of these books take place in different parts of history, different parts of the country. They look at different issues that women were facing within those time periods. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation where we have so many different viewpoints and so many different areas that we can talk about. So I'm really looking forward to it. As always, if you've joined one of our chats in the past, or if this is your very first one, welcome. I'm excited to have you. If you leave us a question down in the comments section up until 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, so that's the end of our broadcast, you have an hour to leave us a question in that comment section. When you do, you will be automatically entered to win a flash giveaway. We are going to give away an early copy of The Seamstress of New Orleans by Diane C. McPhail. It's an incredible novel that you're really going to want to read. Little spoiler alert, it is one of our book club picks coming up in the next couple of months. So if you want to get a jump start on some of those conversations, maybe you want to win this book. Anyways, if you enter to win, good luck. Give us some fun questions. I always love y'all's questions. You give us such fun talking points. So please come join us in the comments. I'll be hanging out there while I talk with the authors, and I always like to hang out with you guys as well. I'm going to stop blabbering now. You guys aren't here to see me. You're here to talk to the authors. So I'm going to bring them up on screen. Please, everyone, drop some love and some excitement down in the comment section for our special guests. Hi, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You guys already kind of heard me blabber on and carry on and on about how excited I am for this. And I was talking about it a little bit before we went live too. I always love having conversations with y'all, and I've been looking forward to this one for a while. So for any readers that aren't familiar with you or your work, I would love to give you guys a chance to just introduce yourselves and your books right up off the top. And I'm going to let Denny kick us off. So Denny, if you will introduce yourself and your book to our readers.
Well, my name is Denny S. Bryce. I am what book is this? Number 2 on a long, lengthy list of books. In the background here, you'll see Wild Women in the Blues, which was my debut book a year ago tomorrow. And coming April 26th is In the Face of the Sun, another dual storyline. I actually adore the blurb that Kensington wrote, and I'm just going to read the first paragraph. At the height of the civil rights movement, amid an America convulsed by the 1960s, a pregnant young woman and her brash aunt embark upon an audacious road trip to confront a decades-old mystery from the 1920s Black Hollywood in this haunting novel of haunting novel sounded really good. Novel of historical fiction from the author of Wild Women in the Blues. So that's a little bit about me. I'll talk more about me in a few minutes, I guess.
Yes, we
Yeah.
will have lots of conversation coming up. Thank you so much, Denny. And
Thanks.
then let's jump to Donna. Donna, will you introduce yourself and your book to our readers?
Absolutely. My name is Donna Everhart, and some of you out there may know that I write Southern fiction, Southern historical fiction. The Saints of Swallow Hill just released January 25th, 2022, just this year, a couple months ago. It's my fifth novel. My first four novels were all coming of age stories told with a first person point of view by young protagonists. So I decided to branch out and do something new and different. And this book is set during the Depression era. It takes place between North Carolina and Georgia. I have two protagonists, a man who's in his late 20s named Delwood Reese, and Raylyn Cobb, who is in her mid 20s. And these two individuals do not know each other. Raylyn Cobb is in North Carolina. Delwood is, he likes to be called Del, is down in Georgia. And they each experience a life altering event that will send them into a very unusual environment where they are both looking to sort of go off the grid a little bit. Each has had this event happen to them, and it has compelled them to go to work in a labor camp that produces turpentine, which is a bit of lost Southern history. When I started researching for this novel, a lot of people did not know about the turpentine camps, but that's what my home state's nickname is all about. We're called the Tar Heel State, and it's sort of the origin story of where that came from. So that's a little bit about my latest. I'm sure I'll get to talk about it more.
Yes, you absolutely will, because I definitely have questions prepared to delve into the history of that. So before we get sidetracked right off the top, Amanda, please introduce yourself and your book to our book club.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Skenandore. Super thrilled to be here with everyone today. I've written 3 novels. The latest one that came out was The Second Life of Muriel West last year. And then I have a new book coming out at the end of June, The Nurse's Secret. And I don't have a commonality, I should say, between a lot of my books. But if I had to pick one thing, I would say that I have an interest in medical history. And I also, my day job, I work as a nurse. And so that's sort of what led me to write The Nurse's Secret. Donna, you mentioned that your book is sort of an origin story about the turpentine industry. And The Nurse's Secret is a little bit similar. I was interested in the history of nursing in America. And what I uncovered during my research was so fascinating that I thought, yeah, there is a book here to be written. And so that's what I set out to do.
Perfect. I am so excited to delve into all of these books. Like I said, I really love that we've got such a diverse range of stories and time periods and settings. This is just going to be a really fun conversation for me, being the nerd that I am. So I know, both Amanda and Donna mentioned a little bit about the very initial inspiration. Denny, you talked about that dual timeline, but I would love if you could kick us off with we're going to delve a little bit more into the full-on inspiration and where these story ideas came from. And I just want to launch off with Denny, because one of the dual timelines in your story has to do with Black Hollywood and, these starlets and this society that, don't get to see a lot of in fiction, either on screen or on the page these days. So I would love for you to kick us off on what that inspiration was and where that initial story idea came from.
Well, I can certainly do that. The 1928 storyline, however, did begin with a trip I made to Los Angeles in 2017 to the Los Angeles Film Festival. I should say that I am a movie buff, in general, but I'm also a old hotel buff. So I was staying at the Culver Hotel, which was built in 1920 in Culver City, and in their room where they have all of this research information was information about a hotel called the Hotel Somerville. I'd never heard of it. It's a Los Angeles hotel that opened in 1928. And the history behind it is that during that time period, African Americans could not stay at the fancy luxury hotels in Hollywood. So the Hotel Somerville became the first luxury hotel for African Americans only. And it was built and financed by African Americans. And I went to visit the corner of 41st Street and Central Avenue to see that building, which was still there. And it was at the time a senior living facility. So I just stood outside and took pictures. And this lady said, "Come on inside. What are you doing out here?" And I said, "I'm gonna write a book about this hotel." And so at the time, I was not planning to write a book about, I just wanted to go inside. But that was the inspiration to start digging in. And I love stories about entertainers. Personally, I was a former entertainer. I was a professional dancer for a number of years. I gave my acting chops their best shot, but I was not a great actress. I also sang, and actually I'm taking singing lessons now I want to be a jazz singer next. So, every career has its, you want to do everything all the time. But anyway, so that love really, the hotel, old Hollywood, 1928 Hollywood also, I'll just mention one of my favorite characters from the book, or I shouldn't say favorite, one of my more interesting historical figures who is in the book is a man named Stephen Fetchit, who is also known as Lincoln Perry. He was the first multimillionaire African-American actor. So I think I'll stop. You always have to give me a little sign because I just go like this.
That's totally fine. If I ever need to cut you off, I will start waving or something.
Just start waving.
But again, that might be hard for me because I'm so ready to hear all of it. I am going to sidetrack us already one question in because I'm curious for Amanda and Donna. Denny mentioned that she really loves the history of old hotels, and that has me wondering if either of you have like a niche historical thing that you just love to learn about. Like for me, I love old and vintage music boxes from every era. Like you could take me to a museum full of them and I would be there for hours. So I'm interested to know if either of you have some kind of, there's a thing in history that you're always interested in looking at. And whoever wants to raise a hand and go first, I know it's an off the wall question, so I won't put you on the spot.
I think for me, and maybe it started with The Undertaker's Assistant when I was writing about embalming, that I just, and maybe with my background as a nurse as well, I find medical history so fascinating. And the way that we, used to treat disease and approach, I think, the whole, industry of medicine. And so all of those little things from, old tools that they used to use to old, herbal remedies to like leeches and bloodletting, all of that I just find so interesting.
I definitely love that. Just as a side note, I'm from a medical and funeral family. Well, those are my parents' occupations, so I understand the obsession. Donna, how about you? Do you have like a niche historical thing that you just love to learn about?
Well, the one thing I wanted to say real quick to Amanda is there was a show out that my husband and I were absolutely fascinated with, and I wondered if you ever watched it or had heard of it, called The Nick.
I have heard of it, but I haven't watched it.
It only lasted like a couple of seasons, I think, but it was at the very beginning of the century, and like the 20th century, the early 1900s, when they were doing all of those things that you're talking about with. And it was based on, I think, the hospital up in New York, Knickerbocker Hospital or something like that. But anyway, a little sidetrack there. But
Ooh, thank you.
I wish it was still on because we absolutely loved it, and it had all of those things in it that you were talking about, where they were experimenting with how to put people to sleep, and the ether, and something blew up, and the patient burned up right there on the operating table.
Whoa.
I mean, it was pretty interesting,
Oh, wow.
But for me, I don't have exactly a niche, but if I were going to say what fascinates me, that is uncovering something in history that people do not know about, which happened to be the case with my latest book. But there's always a little tidbit of something else that may happen, in any of my stories. And an explanation of that might be in my second novel, The Road to Bittersweet. The inciting incident for that story was the 1940 flood in the North Carolina mountains, which a lot of people did not know about, didn't know all of the details. And so I'm always looking to try to uncover some little piece of North Carolina history, or just Southern history in of itself, that you might not know about. And that was, again, in particular, the case with the Saints of Swallow Hill, which I'll talk about more later.
Yeah.
I'll just stop there unless I have the opportunity now. But that's really it for me, just looking for unknown history.
That's perfect. And that actually gives us the perfect opening for one of my next questions. And, Donna, I will let you kind of kick us off on it. I was going to ask if you guys had uncovered a really interesting or unknown part of history while doing the research of your book. Now, obviously, Donna, that is the whole angle of your book, is that no one knew about, these turpentine camps, outside of this area. I certainly didn't, and I'm from the South, so it's definitely interesting to me. So definitely want to hear a little bit more about that. But for Denny and Amanda, kind of be thinking while we're all chatting, if there was a piece of history that you incorporated into your books that was surprising or unknown to you while you were researching. So Donna, why don't you kick us off and tell us about this unknown history that you uncovered and delved into for your research?
Okay. So like we all do when you're writing or attempting to figure out your next book, my first thing that I always do, of course, is Google. And there are a lot of different sites that I use, like NCpedia, which is an encyclopedia type online thing for North Carolina. I ran across the term naval stores. I had never heard of it. I had no idea what it was. And so that was the impetus of, I just was very curious. It's like, what are they talking about? Naval stores. I mean, it was such a odd matchup of names, Well, that led me to understand that this was the extraction of pine gum or pine resin from the longleaf pine trees. And that in turn was distilled, strangely enough, much like moonshine, and I wrote the book, The Moonshiner's Daughter. What? I'm back to distilling again? But anyway, you take the pine gum and it is distilled into these products, tar, pitch, and turpentine. And I understood very early on that North Carolina was a top producer of naval stores. And this was during the 1700s up through the late 1800s. And it was used to waterproof the old wooden sail ships. And that was unbelievable to me. And I'm like, North Carolina did this, and top producer in the world. So then I started uncovering facts about how this work was done. Very uncommon work in an environment known as a pine forest savanna, which are almost non-existent. There were over 90 million longleaf pine trees at one time, and now it's down to like 3 million acres of it, 90 million acres down to 3 million acres. And so it has really, not only through the turpentine industry, but also just lumber companies would come in after the trees were bled dry and take them down. So I became very sad about that. But in a nutshell, as soon as I learned how rough and how squalid and how tough these turpentine camps could be, I was like, aha, that's a perfect setting. That's just the right kind of setting, because I love to put my characters in peril. So Naval Stores was a domino effect. It just kicked it off. And again, it's the origin story for where the name Tar Heel actually comes from. It's from these turpentine camps.
Wow, that's so interesting. I definitely didn't know any of that history before this book. So I'm really glad that you discovered it so that you could write about it. And let's jump over to Amanda next. Amanda, was there a part of the research or a part of history that you kind of went, oh, I didn't know this before I embarked on this adventure?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the things I found so interesting, if you look at like today, Gallup does all these polls, like what is the most trusted profession? And nursing ranks number one almost every single year, which, you know, is a wonderful thing for the profession. I hope we can keep doing that, because, you know, we should be working, we should be doing a good enough job that we are very trusted. But what fascinated me was that if you go back like 150, 160 years, you know, the nurses were totally untrained, untrustworthy. A lot of them were illiterate. You had nurses being sort of commandeered from workhouses, from prisons. Like the conditions in hospitals were terrible, and nurses were doing nothing to improve that. And I found that so fascinating. And then this shift happened about 10 years after the Civil War with the influence of Florence Nightingale. And all of a sudden, you have this almost like 180 turn, where now they're really focusing on finding women who are what they would say of good breeding, right? So that you had to be educated and you had to be from a certain class. And, you know, you couldn't, you had to be white, you had to be religious, which meant generally Protestant, right? So there were all these things, this weeding out of people to get this like hyper idealized version of what a nurse would be, and then, you know, you can still see, I think, the ramifications of that today, and why it took the profession so long to open its doors to so many people, you know, whether it's men or people of different religious backgrounds, women of color, people of color, all of those things. And so that was a really fascinating thing, that sort of evolution of nursing, from people who were completely untrained to this strange ideal, you know, back to where we are today, where you see all types of people as nurses. And so that was one of the fascinating things that I found as I was researching. I thought, yeah, there's a book here, but I enjoy stories where you have sort of a fish out of water character. So I didn't want to make my main character one of these, you know, I think hyper proper women. Instead, she's a thief from one of these real, you know, from the slums of New York at the time. And then, you know, it's an interesting way for her to go and to be able to kind of give a more, I think, frank look at this new system of nursing that's beginning.
I can't think of anything more terrifying than an illiterate nurse or nurse who just has no idea what they're doing. That truly just, that was new nightmare fuel that you just put into my brain. So thank you for that. All right.
You can't read the author's notes.
Yes. No, y'all's author notes at readers, if you don't read the author notes, you need to start, because I promise you, every time they're going to make you go, oh no, this is terrifying. All right, but I do want to jump over to Denny. What was a part of history that you either didn't know or didn't know much about prior to jumping into your research that just really kind of blew you away?
Well, I'll start by saying one of the joys of writing books about the African American history in the 20th century is that there hasn't been that much written. Mm-hmm. There's more and more being written, which is a fabulous thing. Yes. So a lot of what I learned, because I'm not a historian, I am a history buff. So I was learning quite a bit doing the research that I did for this particular book, which included a lot of time spent with the Library of Congress, maps, and all that sort of fun thing to get a lay of the land. But when it comes to, I have to look down at my notes because I'm also in the midst of writing a book that's 19th century. And so I'm like, okay, what am I talking about?
Right.
There are a couple of things that I just was wowed by in working on In the Face of the Sun. One was one of the reasons I love hotels is I'm a fan of architecture. Coming from Chicago, of course, there was Frank Lloyd Wright and all of those fabulous homes at that time. I found out that there was a man by the name of Paul Revere Williams. He was the first African American in 1923, I believe, to be admitted to the National Association of Architects in Los Angeles. Was just amazing in terms he built homes eventually for Lucille Ball, for King Vidor. He did all sorts of fabulous things. He was also someone who learned how to draw backwards in reverse because he wasn't allowed to sit next to a prospective client. He had to draw everything upside down and backwards as a Black man. So I found that bit of history amazing. So I sort of shaped one of my characters as the second best Black architect in Los Angeles, because I didn't want to do Paul's story.
Right.
But one of my characters is an architect, a wannabe architect in the story. The other bit of history that just wowed me was Lincoln Perry. For those who may not be old film buffs, Stephen Fetchit is a very controversial character from the 1920s. I think he acted all the way through the 60s or 70s, and he literally played the name Stephen Fetchit. It was a caricature, it was derogatory to the African American male or person. However, he was a literate, smart man, except he liked to party way too hard. The one thing I found out about him that was fascinating to me is that he bought all of the clothes of Rudolph Valentino after he passed away because he just hated the idea of all that cashmere going to waste.
Who can blame him?
I was like, okay. And again, I don't even think that made it into the book. This is the other thing about doing historical research and historical fiction. Some of the most fascinating tidbits that you will stumble upon. They don't go anyplace in that particular book that you're working on. So
right. I definitely think that I would just fall completely down all kinds of rabbit holes at every turn during the research process for these books. Especially like you were saying, Denny, looking at architecture and these figures around these different areas. I would have been lost in time, and my editor would be screaming.
Another thing that just will get you off track.
Right.
Yes.
Anyway. Yes, I'm trying not to get distracted and off track right now, just wanting to ask more questions. So, but I will jump off of this part of our conversation. We had some readers curious about what the typical research process looks like for you guys. Denny, you mentioned maps and, actually looking at these hotels in person, kind of examining that architecture. So I'm curious what research looks like for each of you, because I have to imagine that, it's similar in a lot of ways, but you probably also approach it differently in a lot of ways. And I'm going to add on to that reader question with, do you do all of your research prior to writing, or do you continue to research as you're writing your book? So I'm going to start this round off with Amanda.
So I think research is one of my favorite parts of the whole process of writing historical fiction. I will start with a lot of research, in particular because I'm interested in writing about things that maybe I don't initially know a lot about, and so I have to get a good base of understanding before I can start. Usually that involves certainly a lot of online research, but looking at memoirs if there are, some of that first person source material. And if I can, I really like to go and visit. So when I wrote The Second Life of Muriel West, I was able to go to Louisiana and visit Carville, the leper colony where the story takes place. And then I'll start to write. And when I'm writing the first draft, I might stop momentarily for maybe a day or two if I encounter something really large that I need to research so that the book doesn't go off in this completely inaccurate trajectory. But mostly I just like to kind of push through. And if it's a small detail, like, what type of fabric might there be, might it be popular at that time for a particular type of clothing? I mean, something really small or, specific like that. I'll just put a little mark in my manuscript so that I know to go back to that so I can kind of keep with the story. And then in the revision phase, I'll do more research on those kind of specific details to sort of plug in the holes.
Awesome. I love that you leave yourself notes. Again, this is yet another on a list of 700,000 reasons why I'm not the writer in this organization, is that I would just be like, no, I'm just going to keep researching, and then the writing wouldn't actually happen. Anyways, Denny, how about you? What is your research process like? Do you do it all before, or do you kind of mix it up?
Well, I learned a lesson with Wild Women in the Blues, my debut novel. It took me 6 years to write it. 4 of those years I was probably researching. And I'm joking. But it took, I did a lot of research that I didn't use. And so what I do now, because I have, several projects that I'm working on, is my initial research is to establish my goal, my goalpost. What are the things that happen during the time period that I am writing my story in that are unchangeable? What are those big moments? Then I scale it down. What are the moments that are most pertinent to my main characters? I am writing, my next 2 books will be biographical fiction in nature, biographical historical fiction in nature. So then I'm incorporating the facts of a historical figure's life. In my first 2 books, we're looking at fictional characters. So I have to shape what and who they are. And that's where I look for the research. In Wild Women in the Blues, for example, my main character in the 1925 plot line was a seamstress. She really was a good sewer. So I really had to dig into that aspect of what was going on in 1925 in patterns, McCall's patterns and sewing machines, etc. In The Face of the Sun, in my 1968 storyline, they're in a 1968 Mustang. So I had to really learn a lot about Mustangs, and also what did Route 66, because there's a road trip involved from Chicago to LA, what did that entail in 1968? What did the Green Book, which was a book that African Americans used to make sure they weren't going to be harmed in travel, but they stopped producing that book in 1964 around the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But my character in 1968, she doesn't trust anybody, so she still uses her Green Book, which I thought was hysterical. But she had to. She was smart to do it. But anyway, so research is something I do in phases now. As I mentioned, I'm working on the 19th century character biographical fiction, and what's fabulous and what's daunting about it is that in certain areas you have so much history that you really have to pare down, because Queen Victoria is in that story, as well as West Africa. So anyway, it really is a science, I feel. I'm only on book 3 now that I'm working on. It's a science that I'm going to continue to learn about.
Well, I think that's also one of the really great things about being a writer. I say from the perspective of someone who works so closely with all of you guys, is that it is always a constant learning process and a constant change, which I think, for me is always interesting, because I learn something new from, y'all every time we do these rounds of, okay, how did this one come about? So I think that's a great way to go about things. And Donna, how about you? What is your research process like, and what's kind of the timeline of your research process?
Well, Amanda and Denny have kind of touched on it a little bit. I think we all have our own unique process too. I've seen posts on social media where writers will use Post-it notes, and they'll be, just all over the place, and that would make my head explode. I'm a very linear kind of writer. I don't know how else to define it other than it's like I've got blinders on. Forward, crack the whip. With the Saints of Swallowtail, I actually attended a real demonstration that was held at Campbell University, conducted by a gentleman named Brian Avery. What I didn't realize at the time was that the demonstration for what it was about was showing how to chip the pine trees to get the sap and then go through the distilling process to get the products. That was not really the time frame that I was looking for, because that was more of the 1700s to 1800s time frame for the wooden sail ships and when they needed all of that kind of stuff. And I said, well, this was great, but I know that I'm writing my book in 1932. So I used dissertation papers. I used thesis papers that had been written on this industry, which blew my mind because, again, I was completely ignorant of it, having lived here all my life. And these two gentlemen that wrote those papers turned them in like 2009 and 2013. So it's fairly recent that people were writing about this industry. But for me, it involves I'm looking for the inciting incident, like I mentioned in The Road to Bittersweet. I'm looking to uncover some historic facts that I might be able to use as part of the plot, for example. But once I know I've got sort of the groundwork laid to begin, I go ahead and start. I know I'm going to research throughout the entire novel. And I have done exactly what all of you have talked about, which is to almost, oh, I'm supposed to write the book, kind of thing. It's like, 2 days later, I've written nothing because I'm so busy reading about the sweat boxes that were used in these turpentine camps for punishment and the craziness that was going on with that. But with every single book, I have done this. I have, researched enough material to begin the story, and then I continue to research and find my way through the story. And I can give you one example. And again, I'm kind of going back to The Road to Bittersweet, but this is, I think, happened with every single book. I will run up on a scene where I want my characters to use a product. And I'm just writing along, having a good old time, putting my scene in place. And then it's like, she covered it with plastic wrap. Oh, plastic wrap even available. And so off I go to look up to see if plastic wrap was available or if Snickers bars were out then. You know what I mean? So it's just a perpetual thing. It's ongoing and it never ends. And it's a lot of fun. I think I agree with Amanda that it's almost one of my favorite things to do as well. So
I could definitely see that being one of the funner parts of the whole process. I mean, like you guys, I'm a history person, so I would just get lost in that part of it and then, forget, oh, wait, write the book, put the words together. But I think it definitely helps for you, Donna, that you've got that blinder system of I'm just going to write and I'm going to move forward. I'm definitely one of those people that I would need the Post-it notes, that they'd have to be 100 different colors and in increasingly giant font and closer to my face. So
I have seen that. And Denny might be pointing to Post-it notes.
I was going to say, I feel like Denny and I are on the same page.
I love, my favorite part is outlining. I love the outline. That's why I do the goalpost. I put the goalpost on the certain colors on my little board, and then we go to the other. It goes on and on and on. It's just it's like a puzzle. It's putting together a puzzle piece. And I like to visually, since I'm very visual, and sound and sight are very important to my process in writing books. But I love doing an outline that has the turning points, that has all the stuff, and the Post-its.
Well, and that's a great. Sorry, I'm going to lose my voice now.
I'm always impressed. I mean, you know, I see it and I'm like, that is so impressive. Oh my gosh, how do they do that? You know?
Yeah.
That's a great craft building question. You know, are you an outliner or are you a pantser? Do you just start writing and let the story take place and see where you wind up? I have a feeling Denny is not a pantser whatsoever.
I pants at a certain point on a scene level.
Got it.
But not on the overall level, because it would take me forever to write a book. And I don't have, now that I'm under contract to write books, I don't have forever to do that. I also don't write in order.
Interesting.
Yeah, I write, that's why I'm a Scribner junkie. Love Scribner. That's why the outline is so important, because I can go to scene 37, chapter blank, and just go, that's what I'm feeling today, and that's what I write. Because I already know the character arc. I know when they're doing this, that, and the other. Sometimes I'll do, because that's the dual storyline in me too, because those stories have to be outlined in order to hit the same turning point in both time periods. And also making a choice in my first book, Wild Women in the Blues, the decision was for my character arcs to flip. One person is starting high, one person is starting low, and as the story goes, they cross, and then they come down, and then they level as to whatever the win is going to be at the end of the book, if it's a win. In The Face of the Sun, since I have one character on both sides of the storyline, 1928 and 1968, a character named Daisy Washington. She was Daisy Johnson, but I had too many J's. So Daisy Washington ended up, having a significant personality change. So what happened to her and what happened in 28 to make her the woman of 68, where she's not the POV character? It's another character that's a POV character, and her arc is different in whatever way I wanted to crisscross those people. So again, and that I did not write in order at all. You know, there were a couple of scenes that I knew I had to get out. I had to write some big scenes, and then I'll write to a scene as well, to a big turning point. So yeah, I'm
truly mind-blown.
But I love puzzles, so to me it's like a giant puzzle, and I'm trying to put it together. Now I am writing this biographical fiction linear, and that's making me crazy. I'm not going to do it anymore.
I'm going to say that I would absolutely lose my way. That sounds almost like when you go into the house of mirrors.
That's a way of putting it. I'd lose my way.
Yeah, it would be like going into the house of mirrors, and I would be like, I'm going to get out of here.
Oh my.
It sounds brilliant. It truly sounds brilliant. I wish I could do that, because sometimes you get stuck and you want to move forward. And see, Denny, the way you have it set up, you can, because you can flip through Scribner, as you just said, and go, okay, today it's not going to be that because I'm not feeling that. I'm going to work on this. And so you are always probably productive, where I'm doing like this, like, okay, I am totally stuck. How am I supposed to move these characters forward? I can't do it. Might as well go feed the birds.
I think that's a good way to do it too. I'm sure the birds appreciate
Very
it.
happy.
But remember I said I get stuck on the scene level.
Yes.
That's And that can be a big deal because I've spent 3 days this week on one scene, and then I stopped and went to another scene.
Right.
Enough of this madness.
I'm like you, Denny, in that I love to outline. I love Scrivener. But even I did have a dual time. My first book was a dual timeline novel, but even that I wrote chronologically and then wove the two together, which was not certainly not the best way to do it, but because I had to do a lot of editing, right, to get like you were saying, to have the arcs, coalesce. But somehow I feel like what I would do is I would jump to the scenes that I love to write, and I would write those, and then I would have a hard time forcing myself to go back. I mean, obviously you have to because you got to get the book done, but somehow it's easier for me to force myself to write the scenes I don't want to just keep going. Otherwise, maybe that would be a good thing because maybe then it keeps you from. Maybe there's a reason I don't want to write certain scenes, and it should be telling you something.
Well, the scenes that I gravitate toward writing early are usually the action scenes, or if you do Dwight Swain scene sequel, it's the scene where there's a lot of action going on because I love the action scenes. The emotional scenes are the ones that I sometimes back away from and wait to get in there for that, because that's a whole and in one book, I think I wrote the entire emotional arc scenes and then filtered around it because it's hard to keep track. These books are long.
Yeah. That's why I'm even more impressed that you just write in whatever order you get inspired to write in. So I can't wrap my brain around it.
I also fast draft. How many of you all fast draft?
I will do that because I have to get my first draft done, and then I can, work the editing magic. Yes, but if I can't wrap my head around the story if I don't have it done.
I in the book I'm working on now, I have fast drafted like 65,000 words, and I know it's going to be about 100,000 words, and that has given me another. What is the best way? Confidence is so wrong, but I feel better about where this book is going. I know the last act of this book. I know where she's at. I know why she's there. I know, all of this stuff, and that helps so much.
I always know my ending. I have always known with every book I've written, I've always known the endings. And for some reason that does help.
I didn't know the ending of Wild Women in the Blues. Oh. Well, remember, I'm working on book 3, ladies. You've been out here a minute. I have written 2 books.
And look, trust me, it doesn't really change. It's like, oh my God, I've never done this before.
I just think there's such a fascinating twist that you have at the end of that book. That's why I was like, oh wow, because my brain, I'm terrible with twists, so I admire that all the more. Are
you talking about Saints or?
In Wild Women in the Blues. Although you have a great twist also. But yeah, both of you. That's not my strong suit.
I think that down the road, in the soon road, I'm going to pitch a thriller. I really want to read a thriller. Yeah, set in a historical thriller.
Well,
I'll nudge your editor.
Like the action scenes and the and the emotional scenes you sometimes have to back away from and then come into those later. I am the same exact way, and I can give a good example. Anytime I am writing a scene that's a tough, it's dealing with the antagonist, those scenes, and people are miserable and people are suffering. I am, I mean, my fingers are on fire. And then when I get to the repercussions of all of that, a lot of times I'm like, and I don't want to say that it's because, that I'm not in tune. I mean, literally, I mean, we all know I have not lived, what some of these characters have been through, but I'm just saying that it does take to get it right. You want to take that time, to think about the appropriate response. And, sometimes how your own personal reaction might be isn't going to suit that character. And so you have to get out of your head and into their head and figure it out. And those really are those emotional scenes, and making sure that you nail those and you pull at the heartstrings, and you get all of that in there. Those are the hardest scenes to write for me.
I use dictation.
Oh, smart.
Well, I used to be an actress, so I'll just
Right.
act it out. And then after I do my acting thing and I have it all there, then I edit it. But I do that with the emotional scenes because it's according to, and I also listen to music when I write. Some people write in silence. Sometimes I write in silence, but a lot of time I'm listening to music.
Well, and I would imagine
Emotional stuff is hard.
Right. And I would imagine, especially with some of these historical settings and time periods that you guys are writing in, that music would really get you in that, okay, this is where I'm at in history. This is what I'm feeling and seeing and experiencing. So I could see why music would be a good tool while working.
For my 19th century book, Mendelssohn I'm listening to a lot of things.
That's an excellent choice. I'm going to move us along to, I've got two questions that I definitely want to get to now that we're kind of at the end of our chat. I think I've caught most of the reader questions. We covered a lot of them during our various discussions and sidetrack discussions. So readers, I think we got most of you, but you can always feel free to throw some extra questions in there, and maybe I'll get some answers from the authors that we'll share in the group later. But this is Women's History Month, and this is our last panel Q&A for Women's History for this year, for this month, caveat. But I would love to know if you guys have a particular woman in history that you really admire, or that you just really look up to. Maybe they're inspiring, or even if they're not inspiring, just a woman in history that you love to learn about, or you know a lot about. Women's history in particular is always so difficult to come across in a lot of areas and avenues. So I love to hear, last time I asked this question, I got some very different answers from everyone involved. So I'm really curious who everyone's favorite woman in history, or the woman that they're really interested in history might be. So I will let Donna go first.
Well, I hate, I keep, every time I start to talk about something, I'm talking about the book.
That's okay.
But it just so happens that, of course, I was researching the Depression era, and this was the time for President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was amazing to me. And the reason for that is because I discovered, so I was looking up Depression era recipes. And if you have followed me online, you know that I have made a water pie. And that actually turned out pretty good. But she was known for creating these dishes that she was serving to the president, because it was the Depression, and she was trying to show the country that she and he were eating like everybody else, even though they were in the White House. But they said her dishes, some of them were atrocious. And then the other thing about her that was absolutely fascinating to me, she was a trailblazer. She was the first lady to write a weekly column in a magazine, a column in a monthly magazine, and to host a weekly radio show. And then the other thing that she did was she swore that she wanted to make as much money as her husband, being the president of the United States, in that year, that first year in office. And she did it through her lectures and speeches and other things that she was working on. She made $75,000 her first year as First Lady. And so she matched what his salary was at that time. And I just thought that that was so impressive, you know. And so she really stood out to me. I think she also had some personal difficulties and whatnot. But those were the things that what I liked about her was that she ignored a lot of the chatter that would go on out there. And she moved on with what she wanted to do and with what she wanted to accomplish. And I just thought that was really impressive. Admire her a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that answer. I definitely learned a couple things that I didn't know about her. That's so interesting. And then Amanda, let's hop over to you. Who is a woman in history that you really are intrigued by?
You know, in thinking about the question, I had also thought about Eleanor Roosevelt. I thought about Harriet Tubman. I saw that the movie that came out a year or two ago and was just blown away by her story. Florence Nightingale was a character that sort of comes up in my book. But then, you know, really, I think about the women who have inspired me, and it's on a much smaller scale. Like I think about my mother or my mother-in-law, who was part of the American Indian movement in the 70s, and she was a lay midwife in the 1980s and 90s when, you know, the medical establishment was trying to squash, you know, women from being able to do that, from being midwives, and has, you know, gone on to do all sorts of social justice work and work with the homeless and domestic violence survivors. And so I think for me, as much as I admire these great women in history, I also really admire women that are very close to me. And maybe that's why in my stories, I tend to write about, I think, everyday women, because there are so many of those amazing women in history that were doing great things, but in small spaces. And I want to make room for them too, in our modern understanding of what history was like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an excellent response to that question. I always, my view is always that there are no small people in history and there are no small stories in history. So whether it's someone that everyone knows or someone that only you know, their story matters too. So I love that you put a particular point within your writing to try to give those stories that bigger platform as well. So I love that answer. And then Denny, how about you? Who is a woman in history or women in history that you are really intrigued by or inspired by?
I think I have to follow Amanda's track initially, and I talk about my maternal grandmother who came to this country from Kingston, Jamaica in 1923. And she, when I was a little girl, she'd tell me stories and show me pictures because she ended up in a small town in Ohio, but thought she was going to be living in New York City. And I will one day write the story of her and my grandfather because he had to leave New York for some reasons. And so there's all this mystery and intrigue. But in addition, I definitely admire a number of African-American writers through history from, and I'm going to name them because I wrote it down, Zora Neale Hurston, Maya Angelou, Octavia Butler, and author that some people may not have heard of because she passed away several years ago, L.A. Banks. L.A. Banks wrote the Vampire Legend Huntress series. That was one of those series she wrote. I had the privilege and pleasure of knowing her through an event that, because I was a fangirl of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and was also a fan fiction writer, and my friend Zio Axelrod and I met L.A. Banks. And she was amazing. And one of the things that she said about writing was that the first thing I always do when I start a new story is find out how people made money. And that has been a rule of thumb so far for all of the books I've written. All two of them, and the third one that's coming. But it's really a great way to dive into a time period because of all of the pieces that go together. From how do they make a living? That was real important in Wild Women in the Blues, real important in The Face of the Sun, because in the 1928 storyline, my main character is a chambermaid who's trying to make some extra money by essentially being a gossip. What she does is collect gossip and sell it to a gossip columnist for the California Eagle. So it's that can be a real jumping off point for those characters who are not biographical historical figures to really dig into. So yeah. Making money, and some of the authors that I think have worked so hard, and it's just amazing careers.
Excellent. And I definitely am going to be pestering you to find out that family history as soon as I possibly can, because that sounded fascinating.
I love it.
So we are at our hour, but I'm going to sneak us a couple extra minutes because I really want to ask this last question. It's something I love to ask all of our authors that visit our book club group. We have people in the group who aren't interested in becoming writers or who are on their path to becoming writers. But more so than that, I always just love to have this moment to reflect with our authors that, I work so closely with. And you're all at different stages of your writing paths. Denny, you've made mention that you're newer to writing, but you do still have a couple under your belt. I always love to know if you could tell early writing you, so the you that just started that first manuscript, even if it's the manuscript you never showed anyone, if you could tell that person one piece of advice that you've learned on your path so far, what would you want to tell yourself? In the past, we've had authors answer this about writing, but we've also had just general life comment and what you would want to tell yourself. So it's totally up to you how you want to interpret that question. It is a tough question from everyone that I ask. Everyone gets a little mad at me to throw it out there. So whoever wants to go first, you can either throw a hand up and I will let you go first, or you can just start talking and we'll just go from there.
I'll go.
Okay.
Because I actually have been asked this question before, and I've been around writing and have been a technical writer, marketing writer for any number of years. And as I mentioned quickly, I also wrote a lot of fan fiction. And I wrote for Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I wrote Buffy Spike, the best couple. So
yes,
just letting everybody know.
Agreed. Yeah. There's no argument on this side of the camera.
Thank you. That angel prayer. But I would tell myself, be patient. I think it's an important part. I'm also teaching an MFA program with Drexel right now on marketing, but one of the things we do talk about is patience. And I feel that that's a real important thing, because there's so much pressure in this industry, no matter what stage you are at. Should I be an indie author? Should I be traditional? Do I need an agent now? What does my query letter look like? The list goes on. And then once you get contracted, it's like, oh yeah, that 6 years you had, you got 18 months. That 18 months you have 6 months. So, there's a calmness on some level if you can find it. I think be patient with yourself, and it's less heartache, less hardship, and a lot of positiveness that you can find with the writing process, because it is challenging.
Perfect. I love that. I think that's a great piece of advice for people who are writers and just general as well. How about Amanda? Why don't you go next?
I think I would tell myself that it's the people that you meet along the way that matter the most, because there's so much focus, you know, when you're beginning, like, I've got to get this book done, I've got to find an agent, I've got to find a publisher, I've got to do all these things. And looking back, you know, it's the other writers that I've met, it's that have become, you know, friends and mentors. It's the readers that I've met that have made the most difference in my life. Visiting, you know, I've had the opportunity to go and visit a couple of book clubs, which has just been, I cannot tell you a more fantastic thing than to be able to visit with people who love books and reading as much as I do, and to take joy in those moments, to take joy in those connections, because, you know, there's a lot of running, you know, like Denny said, that's really hard and can wear you down. And I think if you find joy and strength and support in the people, you know, that's kind of will help you bear you through the more difficult times.
Perfect. That's a great response too. I never have anything super smart to say after these, because I'm always just like, oh yeah, I wish I had ever thought of saying that to myself. I want everyone to write these down so I can stick them on my mirror later. And Donna, how about you close us out? What is the one thing you wish you could tell beginner writer you?
Well, Denny and Amanda have both really hit the ball out of the park with their answers. And I think mine would have been a combination, a little bit of both of theirs. But the one thing that I had jotted down was that I've always been sort of a late bloomer. I wasn't published until, I have to stop and think how old I am, and about 57, you know, so I was 57. And it comes down to sort of what Denny was talking about with the patience thing. Everything in its due time. It will happen, you know, when it's the right time to happen, because I literally started and stopped my first book over the course of 20 years. I started writing The Education of Dixie Dupree probably in the early 1990s. And it wasn't the right time. So there's always going to be that right time. And I would like to also sort of piggytail off of Amanda's comment about the right people, the support people. You will find your group, your people, so to speak. They are there. You might have to look hard for them, but they are there and they are invaluable. And I'm talking about before you get to the reader stage, you know, before the book is out there. You really need to find your support group for during these times when you are just trying to get a page at a time. I wished I had had that. I didn't. I was like alone. You know, nobody at my job knew that I was writing a book. They didn't know it until my company went bankrupt and I had to leave my company in 2012. But I left it on a high note because I had literally just signed on with a agent like 3 weeks before. And so I was like sailing out of my happy as a clam, you know, everything's hunky dory. And then the book didn't sell for 3 years, but that's another story.
Right. That's where the patience comes in.
Tribe, I think is what I'm trying to say. Everything will happen when it's supposed to happen, and find your tribe and just, as Denny said, have patience.
Yeah.
I think all three of those are incredible answers. And I love that they all kind of go together. You know, you can't have one part of that without the other. And I really love your message, Donna, of it's really never too late to go after that dream or to achieve your dream. You know, dreams are infinite and there is no time limit to them. So readers, please let that be a lesson. If there's something out there that you're aching to do, you have time, go do it. You know, we support you. Well, that is our time. I took us a little overtime because this was just such a great conversation. I couldn't cut us off exactly at an hour. So thank you guys so much for joining us. And thank you to all of the readers for your great comments and questions. I had a blast reading them. I loved seeing all the support from you guys for all three of our authors and their books. So thank you so much for hanging out with us for the hour, and I hope to chat with everyone very soon. Have a great evening, everyone.
Everybody.
Bye.